A man lies dead in a pool of blood. A woman's lifeless body is found beside him. The world calls it a tragic love story, but a hidden recording whispers the truth. This was never about love. It was about betrayal, greed, and a secret that refuses to stay buried. Margaret Carter spent 25 years worshipping a man who never truly loved her. Aaliyah Al-Mansoori gave him wealth, power, and a second chance, only to learn she was just another pawn in his game. Richard Carter thought he was in control, until one woman died for him, and the other killed for him. Now, 3 lives are gone, but the truth is still waiting to be found. Because some betrayals don't die with the dead. A hidden recording. A secret waiting to be uncovered. A phone rings. Then, silence. Margaret Carter had spent the last 25 years believing in love, in commitment, in the idea that no matter how much life tested them, she and Richard would always find their way back to each other. Their marriage had been built on the foundations of trust and resilience, but over time, the cracks had begun to form. At 50, Margaret still held on to the belief that love could withstand anything, that no matter what struggles they faced, her unwavering support for Richard would always be enough. She had stood by his side through financial ruin, through failed business ventures, through the loss of the man he used to be. She had taken over responsibilities, ensuring they never drowned in the weight of their circumstances. She had become his anchor. But Richard didn't see it that way. Richard Carter had once been a man of great ambition. In his prime, he had built a thriving business empire, one that gave him the wealth, influence, and prestige he had always craved. But those days were gone. A series of bad investments, betrayals by business partners, and economic downturns had stripped him of everything he had worked so hard to build. By the time he turned 52, he had nothing left, not his wealth, not his confidence, not even his pride. The man he saw in the mirror each morning was a shadow of who he once was, and he despised it. What made it worse was Margaret. She had taken control, managing the household finances, making the important decisions, ensuring their survival while he wallowed in his failures. He should have been grateful. But instead, he resented her for it. He resented her ability to adapt, her unwavering support, her quiet strength that only reminded him of his own weakness. To him, Margaret's devotion was not an act of love but a suffocating chain that bound him to a life he no longer wanted. He wanted an escape. He needed an escape. But he had no means, no way out. And then, fate intervened in the form of Aaliyah Al-Mansoori. At just 25 years old, Aaliyah was the embodiment of everything Richard had lost: youth, power, wealth, and unshakable confidence. Born into an elite Emirati family, she had never known hardship. She had never worried about money or stability. She had never felt the sting of failure. To her, the world was a playground, and she moved through it as if she owned it. But Aaliyah had her own desires, her own preferences. Unlike most young women her age, she had always been drawn to older men, men with experience, authority, and a quiet kind of desperation. There was something intoxicating about men who had once been powerful but had fallen from grace. She enjoyed the way they looked at her, the way they needed her, how they hung onto her words like they were their salvation. Richard Carter was exactly the kind of man she loved. She saw him first at a private business club in Dubai, an exclusive gathering for elite entrepreneurs and wealthy investors. Aaliyah was used to the attention of younger men, men who threw themselves at her, eager to impress her with their family wealth and luxury cars. But Richard? He was different. He sat alone, swirling his whiskey, exuding a quiet kind of disappointment. He didn't look at anyone. He didn't seek validation. That intrigued her. So, she approached him first. She slid into the seat beside him, flashing a smile that had melted the hearts of countless men before. "You look like a man who's seen the world," she said smoothly. "Tell me, what have you lost?" Richard had been caught off guard. He hadn't expected to be noticed, especially by someone like her. And yet, there she was, watching him, studying him, intrigued by him. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Desired. Their conversation flowed effortlessly. Aaliyah was fascinated by his past, by the stories of his former success. She told him how she admired men like him, men who had built something from nothing. "A man like you shouldn't be struggling," she told him. "You deserve better." And then, she made him an offer. "Come to Dubai." She painted a picture of a life that Margaret could never offer him. A life of luxury, wealth, and admiration. Aaliyah wasn't just offering him an escape, she was offering him redemption. At first, Richard hesitated. He thought of Margaret, of their home in London, of the woman who had given him everything. But as he sat there, sipping his whiskey, looking into the eyes of a young, beautiful woman who saw him as a man of worth, he realized the truth. He didn't love Margaret anymore. He didn't want to be saved by her. He wanted to be worshipped by Aaliyah. He convinced himself that this wasn't betrayal. This was survival. This was a chance to be Richard Carter again, not the broken man he had become. And so, he took the bait. When he returned home, he lied to Margaret. He told her an old business contact had reached out, offering him an exclusive business opportunity in Dubai. One that could bring them financial security again. One that would finally lift them out of the struggles they had been facing. Margaret never doubted him for a second. Why would she? For 25 years, she had believed in Richard Carter. She had stood by him, loved him, supported him. She had built her entire world around him. And so, when he packed his bags, when he kissed her goodbye, when he promised that he was doing this for their future, she smiled and believed him. She didn't know that this wasn't just a business trip. This was Richard Carter leaving her forever. As he boarded his flight to Dubai, leaving behind the woman who had given him her entire life, he felt no guilt. Only relief. Margaret had always known Richard better than anyone. She had spent 25 years understanding his moods, his routines, the small shifts in his behavior. She could tell when something was bothering him, when he was holding something back. At first, she convinced herself it was just the weight of his failures, the remnants of his business collapse still haunting him. But as the weeks went by, she realized this was different. Richard had changed. He no longer looked at her the way he once did. The man who used to reach for her hand absent-mindedly as they sat on the couch now barely acknowledged her presence. Their conversations, once filled with dreams and reassurances, had become mechanical, filled with hollow pleasantries and vague explanations. It started with late nights at his desk, claiming he was researching new investment opportunities. Then came the missed dinners, the abrupt work trips, and the way he would turn his phone away from her view whenever a message popped up. Margaret noticed how he avoided intimacy, offering weak excuses about stress and exhaustion. He had always been a man of habit, someone who needed order and familiarity. Now, he was unpredictable. He started locking his phone, something he had never done before. He stopped answering late-night calls when she was in the room, only returning them once she was asleep. There were long silences where he would stare into space, his mind somewhere else entirely. Then came the purchases. Unexplained transactions appeared in their bank statements, luxury hotels, designer suits, jewelry. She never received any of these gifts. When she asked him about the charges, his explanations were vague and dismissive. Business expenses, he said. Networking costs. You wouldn't understand. She let it go the first few times. She reminded herself that Richard was trying to rebuild his career, that maybe these purchases were part of the image he needed to present to potential investors. But there was an unease growing inside her, a gnawing doubt she couldn't ignore. One night, unable to sleep, she checked their financial records again. The spending was increasing. The numbers weren't adding up. Then, she found something she couldn't explain away. A flight booking. A one-way ticket to Dubai. For only one passenger. Margaret stared at the screen, her heart pounding. He hadn't mentioned another trip. He always told her when he had meetings abroad. She scrolled through his emails, looking for any sign of an upcoming business deal, but there was nothing. Just silence. Her hands trembled as she sat back. She wanted to believe there was a rational explanation, but deep down, she knew there wasn't. Richard was hiding something, and she was going to find out what. The next morning, she confronted him. She tried to stay calm, to keep her voice steady, But the moment she asked about the ticket, Richard's expression changed. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "The bank statement," she pressed. "I saw the charge. Why are you flying to Dubai alone?" His jaw tensed. "It's just a last-minute business trip. I didn't want to worry you." She didn't believe him. But she didn't push further. Not yet. That night, while Richard was in the shower, Margaret took his laptop. His password hadn't changed. She scrolled through his emails, searching for anything that could confirm or deny his story. But it wasn't his inbox that gave him away. It was his deleted folder. One email thread caught her attention. A booking confirmation for a 5-star penthouse suite in Dubai. A dinner reservation for 2 at an exclusive rooftop restaurant. A receipt for an expensive watch. Her breath hitched as she clicked through the attachments. Then, the final blow. An image embedded in an email. Richard, sitting at a dinner table, a glass of champagne in his hand. And across from him, a young woman. Aaliyah. She was stunning, dressed in an emerald green gown. Her eyes locked onto Richard with an intensity Margaret hadn't seen in years. The timestamp was from 2 weeks ago, the same night Richard had told her he had been in back-to-back meetings. Margaret closed the laptop, her hands shaking. The betrayal was undeniable. Richard wasn't in Dubai for business. He was living a different life. A new life. With someone else. She couldn't breathe. The room was spinning. Every memory of their marriage, every sacrifice she had made for him, every moment she had spent loving him. It all felt like a cruel joke. She wanted to scream, to throw something, to demand answers. But she did none of those things. Instead, she picked up the phone and made a call. "I need you to find someone for me," she said. A day later, the private investigator she had hired sent her a file. She opened it, her pulse racing. Inside were photos. Richard and Aaliyah, arm in arm, strolling through the marina. Richard stepping out of a luxury car, Aaliyah at his side. Richard laughing as he poured wine into her glass. They weren't just having an affair. He was building a new life. Margaret felt something inside her snap. If I can't have him, no one will. She booked a flight to Dubai. Richard had always believed he was destined for more. He had spent years convincing himself that his failures were not his fault, that he had simply been unlucky, that the world had conspired against him. But now, in Dubai, surrounded by unimaginable wealth, he had finally stepped into the life he had always thought he deserved. Gone was the struggling businessman weighed down by debt and the obligations of a mundane marriage. Here, he was reborn. Every morning, he awoke in a penthouse that overlooked the sparkling city skyline. The walls were lined with artwork worth more than his entire past existence. The marble floors cool beneath his bare feet as he stepped into the kind of luxury he had once only dreamed about. He wore nothing but custom-tailored suits, silk ties, and shoes that never touched anything but the polished floors of elite venues. He drank whiskey aged longer than his marriage, smoked cigars that came from places only the ultra-rich knew about. All of this was because of Aaliyah. She had taken him in, molded him into the man he was pretending to be. She dressed him, refined him, gave him access to a world he had long been shut out of. With Aaliyah by his side, doors opened for him. She was well connected, not just through her family's vast wealth but through her own influence. Aaliyah's name alone carried weight, and when she introduced Richard as her lover, people took notice. But the truth was simple. Richard didn't love Aaliyah. He never had. What he loved was what she represented. The power, the money, the absolute escape from the failures of his past. He had spent years feeling small, feeling like a man whose best days were behind him. But now, with Aaliyah, he was someone again. He was no longer just Richard Carter. He was a man who sat at the tables of the elite, a man who was respected, admired, envied. And it was all a lie. Because Richard knew the truth, he had no real power here. Aaliyah controlled everything. The money, the access, the illusion of success that he was living off of. He had simply traded one dependence for another. And that was something he couldn't live with. So, he started planning. It had begun as a precaution, a safety net, something small. He had set up an offshore account, transferring money little by little, an amount insignificant enough that Aaliyah wouldn't notice. But over time, as his greed grew, so did the amounts. He had convinced himself that it was justified. He had worked hard to reinvent himself, to step into this life. Didn't he deserve something to secure his future? His plan was simple. When the time was right, he would leave. Disappear. Take the money and rebuild his life somewhere else. Without Aaliyah, without Margaret, without anyone holding him back. What Richard hadn't accounted for was Margaret's persistence. She had landed in Dubai that morning, fueled by rage, by heartbreak, by the suffocating need for answers. She had spent years building a life with Richard, standing by him, supporting him, loving him. And now, after everything she had sacrificed, he had abandoned her without a word. She needed to see him. She needed to look him in the eye and hear the truth. The cab ride to Aaliyah's penthouse was a blur. Margaret's mind raced with thoughts of what she might find, of what she might say. Would Richard try to deny it? Would he beg for forgiveness? Or would he simply look at her with that same distant gaze he had worn for months, the one that made her feel invisible? The building was extravagant, towering high above the city. Margaret barely noticed the questioning looks from the concierge as she marched into the lobby. She wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't her world. But none of that mattered now. She stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for the top floor. Her heart pounded in her chest as she watched the numbers climb. Then, finally, the doors opened. She walked down the long corridor, her hands shaking as she reached the grand double doors of the penthouse. And then, without hesitation, she knocked. The door swung open. Aaliyah stood before her. The woman was breathtaking in a way that was almost unnatural. Her beauty effortless, regal, the kind of presence that filled a room without trying. She was dressed in a silk robe, a glass of red wine held delicately between manicured fingers. She tilted her head, studying Margaret with an expression that wasn't quite surprise, wasn't quite annoyance. Margaret felt the weight of the moment settle over her. Aaliyah wasn't just some mistress. She was someone who belonged here. And then, before either of them could speak, Richard stepped into the room. His smile froze. For a long moment, no one moved. Richard had imagined many things, but this was never supposed to happen. Margaret, the woman he had spent a lifetime with, the woman he had once loved, the woman who had given him everything. Aaliyah, the woman who had given him a second chance, who had reshaped his life into something extraordinary. The past and the present had collided, and in that instant, Richard knew he had run out of places to hide. Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. "Tell me the truth." Richard said nothing. Aaliyah glanced between them, realization dawning in her eyes. "You didn't tell her," she said softly, her voice eerily calm. Margaret clenched her fists. "You told her we were divorced, didn't you?" Richard exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Margaret, listen. Don't." Her voice shook. "Just tell me. Was any of it real? Did you ever love me?" Silence. That was all the answer she needed. Something inside her shattered, something irreparable. She had spent so long loving a man who had stopped loving her. She had sacrificed everything, believing that one day, they would find their way back to each other. But there was no way back. Richard had left her a long time ago. She turned to Aaliyah, who was now watching Richard with an unreadable expression. "Did you know?" Margaret asked. Aaliyah didn't answer. But she didn't have to. Because in that moment, it became clear, they had both been played. Margaret took a step back, her breath shaky. Then she said the words that would haunt Richard for the rest of his life. "If I can't have you, no one will." And with that, she turned and walked away. Margaret stood frozen in the doorway, staring at Richard as if seeing him for the first time. She had prepared for this moment 1,000 times, had imagined the confrontation, the anger, the pain. But nothing had prepared her for the sheer emptiness in Richard's eyes. She had spent 25 years loving this man, sacrificing for him, supporting him through his darkest times. And now, he barely looked at her. Aaliyah stood between them, her expression a mixture of curiosity and irritation. She hadn't expected Margaret to be here. She hadn't expected Richard's past to show up at their doorstep. Margaret's hands trembled as she took a slow step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt like an outsider in a place that shouldn't have existed. "Richard," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond at first. His jaw tensed, his body stiffened. He had to choose his words carefully now. Margaret swallowed hard. "Please, come home." Richard exhaled slowly. "Margaret, we can fix this. We always do," she continued, her voice cracking. "Whatever this is, whatever mistake you've made, we can fix it." Richard closed his eyes briefly before letting out a tired chuckle. "Margaret, listen to yourself. This isn't a mistake." Margaret's breath hitched. "What are you saying?" Aaliyah narrowed her eyes at Richard. "You didn't tell her," she said quietly. Margaret turned to Aaliyah, her confusion growing. "Tell me what?" Richard sighed and ran a hand through his hair. He didn't want to do this. He had hoped Margaret would just go back home, accept the inevitable. But here she was, standing in front of him, forcing him to say the words. "You told her we were divorced, didn't you?" Margaret whispered, her stomach sinking. Aaliyah folded her arms. "Of course, he did. He told me he left you months ago." Margaret looked back at Richard, waiting for him to deny it. "But he didn't. You were never going to come back, were you?" Margaret whispered, her voice barely holding together. Richard's silence was all the answer she needed. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. Margaret felt like she was suffocating. Richard finally spoke. "Go home, Margaret," he said. "This is my life now." Margaret staggered back as if he had struck her. Everything she had believed in, everything she had fought for, had just collapsed. Aaliyah watched Richard carefully, her arms still crossed, her expression unreadable. She wasn't looking at Margaret anymore. She was watching Richard, studying him, reassessing everything she thought she knew about him. Margaret felt the pain before she understood what was happening. A sharp, stabbing sensation in her chest. A tightness, like an invisible hand squeezing her ribs, stealing her breath. Her knees buckled. The world blurred. Her body reacted before her mind could. She collapsed. Richard didn't move. Not at first. For a long moment, he just stood there, staring at her crumpled form. Aaliyah was the first to react. "Richard," she shouted, dropping her wine glass and rushing forward. "Call an ambulance." Richard still didn't move. Margaret lay there, gasping, clutching at her chest. She tried to speak, but no sound came out. Aaliyah fumbled for her phone, dialing for help. Her voice shook as she shouted into the receiver. Richard watched. He wasn't shocked. He wasn't panicked. He just stood there. For the first time in years, he felt nothing. By the time the paramedics arrived, Margaret was gone. She had died at Richard's feet. Her obsession with him had cost her life. Aaliyah sat in silence, staring at the place on the floor where Margaret had collapsed just hours before. The air in the penthouse felt heavy, suffocating, as if death itself still lingered in the space. The sounds of the ambulance, the hurried voices of the paramedics, and the distant sirens had faded, but inside her head, it all replayed over and over again. Margaret was dead. She had died begging Richard to come back to her. She had died because of him. Aaliyah turned her gaze to Richard, who sat across the room in an expensive leather chair, swirling a glass of whiskey in his hand. He hadn't said a word since the paramedics left. He hadn't reacted the way a man should react when his wife of 25 years collapsed and died in front of him. Not once had she seen panic in his eyes. Not once had he rushed to help her. Aaliyah had noticed everything. And now, as she watched him, something inside her shifted. She had once believed Richard to be a man worth saving. A man who had been beaten down by life, discarded, left to rot in his failures. She had thought she was rescuing him. But now, looking at him, she realized something she should have seen long ago. Richard Carter was a man with no soul. Her fingers curled around the armrest of the couch. "You didn't even try to help her," she said finally. Richard looked up, blinking slowly, as if coming out of a trance. "What?" "You just stood there," Aaliyah said, her voice sharper now. You watched her die and didn't even move. Richard let out a tired sigh, as if this conversation bored him. What was I supposed to do? She was already gone. Aaliyah stared at him. You really don't feel anything, do you? Richard placed his drink on the glass table beside him and exhaled. Aaliyah, what do you want me to say? Margaret was a woman who didn't know how to let go. She came here, begging, and when she realized I wasn't coming back, she broke. That's not my fault. Aaliyah felt a strange chill crawl up her spine. Not his fault? Aaliyah stood up, pacing. Her heart pounded against her ribs. Something felt wrong. It wasn't just the coldness in Richard's words. It was the way he seemed completely unfazed by any of it. She had trusted him. She had given him everything. But now, for the first time, she wondered, who was Richard Carter, really? When she glanced at him again, he was back to swirling his drink, as if the conversation meant nothing. And that's when Aaliyah knew. She had made a mistake. She had let a monster into her home. Aaliyah needed answers. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, when Richard eventually stumbled into the bedroom and passed out, she sat in the living room, replaying every interaction, every conversation, every moment of doubt she had ignored. She opened her laptop and started digging. She had access to Richard's accounts. He had never thought to hide them from her. She had set him up with bank accounts when he first arrived in Dubai, had given him the kind of financial backing he needed to start over. At the time, she had done it because she loved him. Now, she was looking at everything through different eyes. The first thing she noticed were the transfers. Money was missing. Millions. Aaliyah's hands trembled as she followed the trail. He had been moving her money, into offshore accounts. Little by little, he had been stealing from her. Her stomach twisted into knots. How long had this been going on? Had Richard ever planned to stay with her? Or had she just been a temporary distraction until he had enough to disappear? The reality of it hit her like a freight train. She had been nothing more than a bank account to him. Aaliyah inhaled sharply, her mind racing. She checked his emails. His conversations with brokers, secret investments, inquiries about properties in other countries. She checked his messages. There were conversations with lawyers about changing citizenships, moving assets, securing private residences. Richard had been planning to leave her all along. Aaliyah slammed the laptop shut, her hands shaking. The betrayal burned through her like fire. She had trusted him. She had believed in him. She had taken him from the ruins of his old life and built him up again. And the whole time, he had been planning his escape. Something inside her snapped. Aaliyah stood up, her breath coming out in short, sharp bursts. She stormed into the bedroom where Richard was lying, half asleep, sprawled across the bed as if he hadn't destroyed everything around him. She threw the laptop onto his chest. "Wake up!" Richard groaned, blinking against the dim light. "Aaliyah, what the hell?" "Look at it," she spat. Richard frowned as he sat up, rubbing his face. He glanced down at the laptop, then back at her. "What is this?" Aaliyah folded her arms. "Your escape plan. Your stolen money. Your offshore accounts." Richard's face didn't change. No shock. No guilt. Just annoyance. "Jesus, Aaliyah," he muttered, tossing the laptop aside. "So what?" Aaliyah felt her heartbeat slow. "So what? That's all you have to say?" she asked, her voice dangerously low. Richard exhaled. "What do you want me to say? That I'm sorry? That I didn't mean it? You're a smart woman, Aaliyah. You should have known what this was." Aaliyah took a step closer. "What was this, Richard?" He leaned back against the headboard, giving her that smirk. The same one that had once charmed her. The same one that had made her believe he was different. "This was survival," he said. Aaliyah clenched her fists. "You were never going to stay," she whispered. Richard shrugged. "Did you really think I would? I was never meant to be someone's kept man, Aaliyah. I appreciate the fun, the luxury, the money, but at the end of the day, I was always going to get back on my feet. And when that time came, did you really think I'd need you?" Aaliyah stared at him. She felt her world crumbling. "Was I just your bank account?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard didn't even hesitate. Yes, that was it. That was the final betrayal. Aaliyah felt her breath hitch, her vision narrowing. Everything around her blurred, except Richard. The man she had saved. The man she had loved. The man who had used her. Something inside her broke. Her nails dug into her palms. Her heart pounded in her chest. Richard was still watching her with amusement. That smirk. That damn smirk. Aaliyah turned and walked to the dresser. She opened the drawer. Her fingers curled around the cold metal. Richard laughed, running a hand through his hair. Oh, come on, Aaliyah. Don't be dramatic. It's just business. She turned back to him and raised the gun. Richard's smirk vanished. Aaliyah's hands trembled as she gripped the gun, her breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts. She had never held a weapon before, never thought she would need one. But tonight, everything had changed. Tonight, she had realized the truth. She had been nothing more than a stepping stone for Richard, a convenient source of wealth, a woman he had planned to discard the moment he was ready to run. Richard was still sitting on the bed, his smirk slowly fading as he took in the sight of Aaliyah standing before him, gun in hand. He blinked once, then let out a short, incredulous laugh, rubbing his forehead as if he found the entire situation amusing. "Come on, Aaliyah," he said, his voice carrying that same easy confidence that had once charmed her. "You're not going to shoot me." Aaliyah didn't respond. Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This is ridiculous. You're acting like a child who just found out Santa Claus isn't real." "Yes, I was going to leave. Yes, I took some money. But you can afford it. You're not exactly going to go broke without me." Her grip on the gun tightened. "Put it down," Richard continued, his voice dropping into something gentler. "You're angry now, I get it. But you're not a killer. You don't have it in you." Aaliyah took a slow, measured breath. She had always been the one in control. The one who dictated the rules, who decided when something ended. But this time, she had been played. And she couldn't let that go. "You used me," she said finally. Her voice was quiet, almost eerily calm. Richard scoffed. "And? People use each other all the time. That's how the world works, sweetheart. You were naive if you thought this was anything else." Aaliyah exhaled through her nose, her fingers flexing on the grip. Richard leaned forward slightly, his lips curling into that smirk again, the one she had once found so damn irresistible. "But let's be honest, Aaliyah. You liked it. You liked saving me. You liked having me depend on you, needing you. It made you feel powerful, didn't it?" He tilted his head. "If you really think about it, we used each other. So drop the gun and let's be adults about this." Aaliyah stared at him. The realization hit her then, sharp and sudden. She had saved him. She had given him everything. And he had taken it all, looked her in the eyes, and laughed. Something inside her snapped. The first shot rang out. Richard's body jerked backward, his eyes widening as he gasped, his hands flying to his chest. His white dress shirt darkened with blood, the deep crimson spreading in jagged patterns. He blinked, trying to process what had just happened, but his body was already betraying him, slumping slightly to the side. Aaliyah's hand shook slightly, but she didn't lower the gun. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. His breath hitched, shallow and panicked, as he looked down at the growing stain on his chest. His fingers, slick with blood, pressed weakly against the wound as if trying to push time backward, undo what had just happened. He looked up at Aaliyah then, his face pale, the realization sinking in. "You," his voice was barely a whisper. Aaliyah stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. She tilted her head slightly, watching him with detached curiosity, as if studying a painting she no longer liked. "You played with two hearts," she murmured, her voice steady, devoid of emotion. She lifted the gun again. "Now, you have none." The second shot tore through him. Richard gasped, his body jerking violently before collapsing fully onto the floor, his head hitting the edge of the bedside table on the way down. His limbs twitched once, twice. Then, he went still. The silence that followed was deafening. Aaliyah stared down at him, at the man who had come into her life, wrecked it, and thought he could walk away unscathed. She waited for some feeling to come. Guilt, remorse, fear. But there was nothing. She inhaled deeply, exhaled, then placed the gun on the nightstand with careful precision. Richard Carter was dead. And he had died alone, just like he had always feared. The blood seeped across the floor, its dark contrast against the white marble almost mesmerizing. Aaliyah watched it spread, pooling beneath his lifeless form. The man who had stolen from her, lied to her, used her, was now nothing more than a mess on her expensive flooring. And yet, she felt no satisfaction, no relief, only a dull, echoing emptiness. She turned away, walking toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Dubai skyline. The city stretched before her, vast and untouchable, lights flickering against the night sky like distant stars. She had won. But there was no way out of this. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Her family would protect her, of course. Money could make problems disappear. But could it erase this? She glanced back at Richard's body, her expression unreadable. He had taken something from her. And even in death, she couldn't get it back. Slowly, Aaliyah reached for the gun again. She turned it in her hands, her fingers tracing the trigger. This was the only way now. The only way to stop feeling like she had lost. Her lips parted as she let out a slow breath. Then, she raised the gun to her temple. The final shot echoed through the penthouse. Aaliyah Al-Mansoori was gone. By the time the security team arrived, it was too late. 2 bodies. A murder-suicide. Richard Carter, the man who had always feared dying alone, had been right about one thing. In the end, no one had won. Aaliyah stood in the dimly lit penthouse, the city lights behind her flickering like ghosts against the vast Dubai skyline. The air was thick, heavy with the metallic scent of blood, the lingering sting of gunpowder. The silence was deafening. The world outside carried on, unaware that inside these walls, everything had changed. Her reflection in the mirror across the room held her captive. She hardly recognized the woman staring back at her. Her silk robe clung to her, dark stains spreading across the once pristine fabric. Her usually immaculate hair hung in tangled waves over her shoulders. Her lips, once so often curved in a smirk of confidence, were slightly parted as if she was still struggling to catch her breath. But it was her eyes that disturbed her the most. They were hollow, cold, empty. Aaliyah Al-Mansoori, the woman who had once commanded power with a single look, had become nothing more than a broken shell. She let out a slow, shaking breath. She was still gripping the gun, her fingers stiff around the cold metal. Her palm was slick with sweat, but she didn't loosen her hold. Her gaze dropped to the floor, to the body sprawled across the marble tiles. Richard Carter. His lifeless eyes were fixed on the ceiling, his mouth slightly open as if he had been about to say something before the second shot silenced him forever. His hand still clutched weakly at his chest, where the blood had bloomed through his expensive white dress shirt. The rich crimson had seeped into the marble, staining it in uneven patterns, spreading like ink across a blank page. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times in the last few hours. But in none of those visions did it feel this quiet. Richard had always been a man who spoke with arrogance, who carried himself with the certainty that he was untouchable. Even when she had confronted him, even when she had held the gun, he had laughed. But now, in death, he was nothing. Aaliyah let out a humorless chuckle. "You thought you could steal from me," she murmured, staring down at him. "You thought you could play me." Her fingers flexed on the gun. "You were wrong, Richard." She turned away from the body, moving toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. She pressed her free hand against the glass, her breath fogging up the surface as she exhaled. The city stretched out before her, alive and humming, as if nothing inside this penthouse had changed. But she had changed. Her world had collapsed. Richard was supposed to be hers. He was supposed to have needed her. She had built him back up, had given him a life he could never have rebuilt on his own. She had taken him in when he was nothing, and in return, he had made her feel like a fool. He had used her, stolen from her, lied to her, And yet, as she stood there, she realized something even worse. Even now, she didn't feel like she had one. The emptiness inside her stretched deeper, more suffocating than before. She had always been a woman who controlled the game. But tonight, Richard had won. Because even though he was dead, he had taken something from her. She could feel it, slipping away, the power she once carried, the confidence, the woman she had always been. He had ruined her. Her gaze flickered back to his body, but this time, she wasn't seeing Richard Carter. She was seeing herself. A woman who had let a man take everything from her. A woman who had become a murderer over a man who had never deserved her to begin with. A fool. Her fingers curled tighter around the gun. She knew there was only one way to end this. Aaliyah stepped back from the window, lifting the gun slightly. She turned it in her hands, pressing her thumb against the trigger, feeling the weight of it. There was no escape from this. Even if she cleaned the blood, even if she called in favors to make it disappear, it wouldn't matter. Richard was dead. Margaret was dead. And now, so was she. Aaliyah moved toward the grand mirror across the room, her reflection now nothing but a ghost of the woman she once was. She tilted her head slightly, taking herself in one last time. I was his fool, she whispered. And now, I am a murderer. She pressed the gun against her temple. Her breath slowed. Her heartbeat steadied. A single shot echoed through the penthouse. And then, silence. The next morning, the sun rose over Dubai, casting golden light over the city's skyline. The city hummed with life, the streets bustling, the world continuing as if nothing had changed. But inside the penthouse, everything was over. When the Dubai police arrived, they found 2 bodies. A murder-suicide. The reports would be clinical, impersonal. They would call it a crime of passion, a tragic ending to a love affair between a British businessman and an Emirati heiress. The headlines would speculate. Some would claim Aaliyah had killed Richard in a fit of rage after discovering his betrayal. Others would paint Richard as a victim, a man caught between 2 women who had both demanded too much from him. The truth? It wasn't buried. Not yet. Because Aaliyah had been smarter than Richard. And Aaliyah had always planned ahead. Inside the penthouse, there was a hidden safe built into the marble walls of the study. A small, inconspicuous panel, invisible to anyone who didn't know it was there. Inside the safe was a single flash drive. It contained a recording. Aaliyah had always believed in security, in insurance. And Richard? He had been foolish enough to leave his secrets in the open. The recording showed everything. It showed Richard admitting to stealing her money. It showed Richard laughing in her face when she confronted him. It showed him telling her she was just his bank account. And most importantly, it showed her pulling the trigger. One day, someone would find it. And when they did, the truth would surface again. Because some stories never stay buried. A phone rings. Then, silence.